In this episode, I wanted to read aloud some poetry of Jane Valentine, who is one of my favorite poets, no longer with us, unfortunately. I was first introduced to her work at Oberlin in the 70s. I had had a meeting with Stuart Freebird, who was a poet and translator and one of the two key editors of Field magazine for a long time, on a Saturday morning in his office in King, in the basement of King. And I was so scared because it was my first time reaching out to any of the poetry faculty there. And I thought of him as a somewhat stern figure, though I know he also had a sense of humor. Anyway, one of the things Stuart liked to do at the end of these kinds of meetings was just on a little pad, sort of like a doctor's prescription pad, he would write the names of a couple of poets that you should read. And one of the poets that he gave to me was Jane Valentine. And I almost immediately was able to find a copy of her book, Ordinary Things, which was a fairly early book of hers, in this wonderful co-op bookstore there. And I just completely fell for her. She was someone who was full of a certain level of candor about the female experience, and also the work was very spacious, somewhat mysterious, not at all opposed to entering the realm of the dream. So she's been one of my favorites ever since. I didn't get to meet her or hear her read in person for many decades, until I think it was 2010, the AWP in Denver. And I was able to hear her read for 10 or 15 minutes. And I think I could barely do anything else the rest of the day. It was just transcendent. So this is a fairly gentle night poem of Valentine's that, in my way of thinking, pulls us into an almost radical interiority by occupying elliptical turf, which is really one of the key things she does. By this I mean beyond even the kind of lyric gap, quote unquote, that Helen Vendler, the critic, talks about as being part of lyric poetry, going back into the centuries. With Valentine, the gaps are bigger than that. So you might enter a gap with her where there's really no clear bridge to the other side, but you're just sort of allowed to be suspended there. She has a way of, in poems like this one, kind of writing poems that live interstitially, at the same time as what I think of as a nocturnal center radiates out into a universal invitation, with the individual ego shrinking to the size of that same needle that she talks about pulling her on in a dream, blurring the boundaries between singular and collective experience. So this is her poem, Even All Night Long. And you can find it in her book, Break the Glass, from Copper Canyon. Even all night long, while the night train pulls me on in my dream like a needle. Even then, down in my bed, my hand across the sheet, anyone's hand, my face, anyone's face, are held and kissed. The water, the child, the friend, unlost. In today's episode, because I've also written about some of Jane Valentine's poems in an essay published in Poetry International, I'm going to be reading to you from that essay. Is the speaker on a train at night, or in bed, or in a sleeper car? Is the train a dream location or an actual location in which this dream of touch and healing occurs? The order in which these early images and phrases come to us, and the suspension of both these brief imagistic fragments and the rules of punctuation, allow us to float in the space of the poem on the page, as well as in the fluidities of its location and identities. GPS won't help us here. Connective tissue feels even more hollowed out than in many earlier Valentine poems, and yet it is possible, if we want, to convert the poem into one long horizontal sentence, filled in with the punctuation and the one additional and that would establish a firmer quote-unquote meaning. But that would kill off the very experience of the poem. Having to dangle more vertically with the slumbering speaker into these deeper and deeper waters where the solidity of earthly boundaries is likely to dissolve, and having to wait as the moment-by-moment images float up from the depths. Are they gifts or are they clues? Like one after another petal of rest and restoration and relief is what allows us, below any logos-based understanding of what has been said, to feel the suffusion of joy and the surprise and depth and mastery of it, that pull the poem into being as it sows its way across all forms of loss and separation. And it feels generous, ultimately, as well as proportionally right somehow, that the images and categories are not overly particularized. Night, train, dream, needle, bed, hand, face, sheet, kiss, water, child, friend. They operate, these words, like primary colors to which we'll add our own nuances of shading and mixing, growing increasingly abstract by the end. But enough of them are concrete enough to establish an immediately accessible, if mysterious and mutable and mutating and mobile scenario, one that allows the last word of the poem, unlost, to reverberate upward into all we have touched. As in many of Transtromer's poems, and I'm thinking especially of his poem, The Half-Finished Heaven, as a good example of this, but there are more. The movement here, line to line, moment to moment, is what I call notational, gestural. This, then this, then this. We are let into the motion of the mind, to its pacing. The pacing of epiphanies, of turns as they occur, or as a rock would skip its lake, here and here and here, as though we're allowed to witness as it happens the activity of noticing just that as it happens, with its slight correctives or widenings of perception in the next moment and the next. And this feeling of being allowed into the being in the process of becoming, is magnified by Valentine's embrace of indeterminacy, so essential to the way this poem in all ways moves. It's instructive here in particular to consider both the sense in which the word indeterminacy implies many possible solutions, and this sub-definition of indeterminate, which so mimics the way this poem emerges, characterized by growth in which the main stem continues to elongate indefinitely without being limited by a terminal inflorescence. Another Valentine offering in Break the Glass, The Whitewashed Walls, draws us in with similar techniques and then sort of departs from them. The whitewashed walls, the chair. Were we nursed by the same wet nurse? The cups of tea undrunk, the crumb of tobacco on your lip, the poems in our speckled notebooks where we warmed our hands over the quick fire, long before the wood stove's wood and coal shifted and settled and warmed us, even months before, even from miles away. As in Even All Night Long, we are suspended, floating in a mostly punctuationless realm of unfolding recognition as it occurs. Similarly, the floating syntax allows for multiple resolutions of phrases and images on the way. Is it that the poems in our speckled notebooks warmed our hands? Or the fire? The way we come across these phrases back to back without any resistant or clarifying signage suggests this, and we're allowed to live happily within this notion before moving to the phrase that follows the line where we warmed our hands, which yields a hand-warming location we'd be more likely to expect over the quick fire. This time out, it's not a descent into dream that we're riding in, but something more like the assemblage of a list of evidence, a spacious one and brief, as though the mind is flashing back on moments of coincidence and connection that confirm the mysterious emergence and then fact of a kind of kinship. I read it as a celebration of the discovery of a newfound friend. It's interesting, though, to see what's missing, the very name of the thing the poet celebrates. Think how different the poem would feel if this were immediately defined and framed by, say, an anchoring title like friendship or new friendship. Among other things, there would be no further need to read the poem, case closed. But also, it would be ham-fisted, a sort of bludgeoning of something alive and multiple and in process into a pre-made container. Instead, the poem's impulse is to share the wonder and oddness and uncanny euphoria of what is, as Paul Celan might say, en route in life as it is emerging, just as he says in his work, The Meridian, the poem is en route. Does this very fact not place the poem already here at its inception, in the encounter, in the mystery of encounter? The poem intends another, needs this other, needs an opposite. It goes toward it, bespeaks it. And unlike the images in Even All Night Long, here we're given the quirky and particular observations and objects of a very particular person and place and relationship in the unfolding. Those cups of tea undrunk and the crumb of tobacco on your lip, which also tells us that the exchange itself is so riveting to speaker and you that its very rituals can't quite get completed. And the wood stove for heat, as well as the discovery of shared sensibility, the same speckled notebooks, and the familiar whitewashed walls and chair, are enough to force this rhetorical, maybe even actual question: were we nursed by the same wet nurse? This is a poem of direct address, an ode-like celebration, ending in those two last lines that lead us backward in time to a feeling of imminence, the glow of something impending that is so typical of something we may associate more with early religious iconography, the Annunciation. Here, though, it's more like an annunciation without announcement. After all, as Lao Tzu might remind us, the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. But what is clear is that the poem is suffused with a kind of shocked gratitude and imminence as the unexpected sweetness of new connection finds its blooms.